On January 18, 2023, deep inside Google's global data centers, a massive network of custom gaming servers quietly went dark. To soften the blow, Google did something entirely unprecedented in the history of the video game industry. They refunded the money. Every controller, every Chromecast dongle, and every digital game purchased over the life of the platform was fully refunded to the American consumer. A billion-dollar initiative, designed to erase the physical gaming console from the living room forever, had unplugged itself after just 3 years and 2 months. Players lost their online worlds. Independent developers watched months of hard porting work evaporate overnight. And a flawless piece of streaming engineering was suddenly reduced to a pile of disconnected white plastic. The paradox of Google Stadia is that the underlying technology actually worked. The data stream was seamless, but the ecosystem around it was fundamentally broken. But the real story of Google Stadia is not only the story of a dark server room in early 2023. It is the story of how a tech giant built the perfect future of gaming and forgot that a platform needs more than just code to survive. Every week, we tell the stories of American devices, platforms, software, stores, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place inside a secretive Google testing lab in 2018. By 2018, the American living room had settled into a rigid technological ritual. Beneath the television set sat a game console, a dedicated computer designed specifically for processing and displaying high-end video games. For decades, this heavy, expensive plastic box was the undisputed toll booth to the future of interactive entertainment. If an American teenager wanted to play the latest blockbuster release, they first had to convince a parent to spend $400 or $500 on the hardware. But the friction did not stop at the cash register. Modern gaming had become a chore of logistics. A player returning home from a long shift at work would turn on their console, insert a physical disc, and immediately hit a wall. A 50-gigabyte required download. The hard drive, a local storage device that keeps files and software permanently on the machine, would fill up, forcing players into a constant cycle of deleting old games to make room for new ones. The industry had accepted this friction because the physics of video games demanded it. Unlike a movie on Netflix, which can simply be buffered and sent over the internet, a video game requires constant two-way communication. When a player presses a button, the system must recognize the input, calculate the physics, render the frame, and display the result on the screen in a fraction of a second. Doing this locally, inside a box, sitting 3 feet away from the player, was widely considered the only way to avoid input lag. But inside the offices of Mountain View, California, engineers at Google saw the console not as a necessity, but as an outdated bottleneck. Google did not manufacture game consoles. Instead, they owned something much larger, one of the most expansive networks of data centers on the planet. A data center is a massive, highly secured building filled with servers, networking equipment, power systems, and cooling infrastructure. Google realized that if they could place custom gaming hardware inside these data centers, they could render the game remotely. They could then use a cloud service, a system that processes data on remote servers instead of on a local device, to stream the video feed directly to the user over the internet, while simultaneously sending the player's controller inputs back to the server. If the network was fast enough, the game console would be entirely replaced by the cloud. In October 2018, Google quietly rolled out a public beta test called Project Stream. They partnered with the publisher Ubisoft to offer Assassin's Creed Odyssey, a massive, graphically demanding open-world game. But there was no software to install and no hardware to buy. American users were invited to play the game entirely through Google Chrome, a standard web browser used to view websites. The test was a revelation. Inside a cramped college dorm room, a student could open a cheap, low-powered laptop that was barely capable of running a spreadsheet, log into Chrome, and suddenly find themselves running a ATA blockbuster at a flawless 60 frames per second. The heavy lifting was being done hundreds of miles away in a Google server room. The browser was merely a window. For the first time, the massive barrier of hardware cost was entirely bypassed. The retention beat was undeniable. The technology actually worked. The input lag, the great enemy of streaming, was remarkably low. The stream was stable. Armed with the success of Project Stream, Google prepared to make its move. In March 2019, at the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, the company rented out a massive auditorium to announce their grand vision to the world. Google CEO Sundar Pichai took the stage, followed by Phil Harrison, a veteran executive who had previously helped launch the original PlayStation and Xbox. The presentation was masterfully orchestrated to target the exact frustrations of the American gamer. Harrison stood beneath the brilliant stage lights and introduced Google Stadia. It was not a box. It was a platform, an underlying technology system that other products, developers, users, and services build around. The pitch was mesmerizing. Harrison demonstrated how a user could be watching a game trailer on YouTube, click a single Play Now button, and be instantly dropped into the game in less than 5 seconds. No downloads, no updates, no patches, no hard drive limits. Stadia would run on televisions, on desktop computers, on laptops, and on smartphones, mobile phones that combine internet access, apps, and computing power. But Google knew that a platform without exclusive content would struggle to survive. To build a true ecosystem, the network of hardware, software, developers, and users that make a platform valuable, they needed games that could only exist on the cloud. To lead this charge, Google hired Jade Raymond, a highly respected industry veteran, to head a new internal development division called Stadia Games and Entertainment, or SG&E. The ambition was staggering. Google promised that because Stadia games were running in the cloud, developers would not be restricted by the physical limits of a console's processor, the main chip that performs calculations. They envisioned massive multiplayer games with thousands of players in a single server, fully destructible environments, and AI-driven worlds that a local machine could never handle. Over the next year, SG&E would quietly begin a massive hiring spree, setting up studios in Montreal and later in Playa Vista, Los Angeles, signaling to the American market that Google was ready to spend billions to secure its place in the living room. By the end of the presentation in San Francisco, the tech press was buzzing. Google had successfully framed the physical game console as a relic of the past, a heavy anchor holding back the future of entertainment. The narrative was perfect, and the technical demonstration was flawless. The promise was absolute, the end of the gaming console. But behind the brilliant stage lights in San Francisco, the physics of the American internet were already waiting. On November 19, 2019, Google Stadia officially launched in the United States. For the early adopters who had pre-ordered the $129 Founders Edition, the arrival of the hardware felt almost suspiciously lightweight. There was no heavy cardboard box left on the American porch, no massive power brick, and no beige or black tower to slide into the entertainment center. Instead, users opened a small, sleek package containing just 2 objects. The first was a Chromecast Ultra, a small digital media dongle that plugs directly into the HDMI port of a television to receive video streams over the internet. The second was the Stadia controller, finished in an exclusive night blue color for early buyers. To the average American consumer, this minimalist hardware bundle represented a massive distribution breakthrough. For a fraction of the cost of a traditional gaming console, a user was essentially buying an empty glass window that looked directly into a multi-million-dollar server farm. But to make this illusion work, Google had to overcome the greatest enemy of cloud gaming: input lag. Input lag is the noticeable delay between a player pressing a button on a physical controller and the corresponding action actually rendering on the television screen. In a fast-paced action game, a delay of even 50 milliseconds can make a game feel sluggish, unresponsive, and ultimately unplayable. Gamers were highly skeptical that a data center located hundreds of miles away could ever react as quickly as a plastic box sitting 3 feet from the couch. Google's solution to this physics problem was a brilliant piece of hardware engineering. Traditional game controllers use Bluetooth to connect locally to a console, which then processes the input. The Stadia controller bypassed the local screen entirely. Instead, it was equipped with a Wi-Fi chip that connected directly to the user's home router, sending the button press straight to the Google data center. The server processed the movement, rendered the new frame, and sent the video feed back down to the Chromecast Ultra on the TV. By removing the local hardware from the input loop, Google shaved off crucial milliseconds of latency. But the controller was only half of the equation. Behind the scenes, the ecosystem was powered by custom Linux servers, machines running an open-source operating system heavily favored for massive enterprise networks rather than personal consumer gaming. Google partnered closely with hardware manufacturer AMD to develop custom GPUs, graphics processing units, the specialized chips required to render high-end 3D environments. These server racks were not just dumped in a single central location. Google leveraged its massive American infrastructure to utilize edge computing, a network strategy that places servers in regional hubs physically closer to the end user, minimizing the geographic distance the data had to travel. When it all worked, the experience felt like magic. Inside a cramped college dorm room in the American Midwest, a student could plug the small Chromecast dongle into a cheap Vizio television, connect the controller to the campus Wi-Fi, and launch a massive, graphically intense game like Red Dead Redemption 2 or Destiny 2. There was no disk drive spinning up. There was no loud cooling fan struggling to keep a processor from overheating. And most importantly, there were no downloads. A game that normally required a 100 gigabyte installation and an hour of waiting was suddenly available in seconds. The player simply selected the game from the Stadia mobile app, a software application on their smartphone used to manage the library, and the stream initiated instantly. The visual fidelity was striking. Google promised up to 4K resolution and 60 frames per second, delivering an elite visual experience to screens that had no business running software of that caliber. For the first time, a premium gaming experience was not limited to those who could afford a massive upfront hardware investment. It was accessible to anyone with a solid broadband connection. The press noted that Google had achieved the impossible. They had made high-end gaming as frictionless as clicking a YouTube video. However, beneath this technical triumph, the platform was built on a confusing foundation. The technology was a massive leap forward, but the business model was anchored in the past. To access the 4K streaming tier, American users were required to pay for a subscription, a business model where users pay $99.99 repeatedly every month for continued access to the service, known as Stadia Pro. But unlike a movie streaming service where the monthly fee unlocked the entire catalog of content, Stadia Pro only provided a small handful of rotating free games. If an American gamer wanted to play the latest flagship release on Stadia, they still had to buy the digital game individually, often at the full retail price of $59.99. This created an immediate psychological friction in the software aisle of the internet. Users were being asked to pay full market price for a video game they could never download, never install on a local hard drive, and never play offline. They were not buying a game. They were buying a license to access a file on a Google server. If their internet went down, the game vanished. If Google ever decided to turn off the servers, the $60 purchase would cease to exist. Despite these underlying economic questions, the sheer quality of the streaming technology kept the momentum alive. The service was expanding to web browsers and Android smartphones, proving that the screen no longer mattered. The heavy lifting had successfully been moved to the cloud. The controller felt right, and the stream was seamless. Yet inside American living rooms, the first subtle limits of this new reality were already taking shape. By the spring of 2020, the American living room had fundamentally transformed. As a global pandemic forced millions of people indoors, the demand for interactive home entertainment skyrocketed. Traditional game consoles completely vanished from the physical shelves of Best Buy, Target, and Walmart. Global supply chain shortages meant that even if an American family had the discretionary income, they simply could not find the physical hardware to buy. The traditional retail distribution system was effectively paralyzed. This unique historical window created the perfect environment for Google Stadia to prove its core thesis. If a consumer could not buy a plastic processing box, the cloud was suddenly the only immediately available alternative. You did not need a physical store. You only needed a Wi-Fi connection. The platform's absolute peak of cultural relevance arrived in December 2020, with the release of Cyberpunk 2077. Developed by CD Projekt Red, it was arguably the most anticipated video game of the decade, promising a massive, densely populated, futuristic metropolis. But when the game finally launched, it proved to be a catastrophic technical failure on older local hardware. The base PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, the exact consoles sitting under millions of American televisions, struggled violently to render the complex environments. Frame rates plummeted to unplayable levels, textures failed to load, and the software frequently crashed, sending millions of angry players back to digital storefronts to demand refunds. But on Google Stadia, the experience was a revelation, because Stadia users were essentially renting a dedicated node inside a multi-million-dollar Google data center. The game ran beautifully, while console players spent hours downloading massive day-one software patches just to get the game to boot. Stadia players bypassed the download ritual entirely. An American gamer could simply sit on their couch, pick up the Night Blue controller, turn on their Chromecast Ultra, and instantly walk into a neon-lit city rendering flawlessly in high definition. For a brief, undeniable window, the tech press, skeptics, and traditional gamers had to concede that Google had been entirely right. The local console was a bottleneck. The cloud was the immediate solution. To press their advantage, Google ran a highly aggressive promotion. Anyone who purchased Cyberpunk 2077 on Stadia at full price would receive a free Premier Edition hardware bundle, a controller, and a Chromecast Ultra shipped directly to their front door. It was a massive financial loss leader designed to force the hardware into American homes, and it worked. However, Google leadership knew that a technology platform cannot survive purely by renting out software that is also available on competing systems. To build an impenetrable ecosystem, they needed exclusive games that could only physically exist on their massive servers. Under the leadership of veteran producer Jade Raymond, Stadia Games and Entertainment, or SG&E, initiated a massive, highly publicized expansion. In late 2019, they opened their first major development studio in Montreal. By early 2020, they expanded into Playa Vista, Los Angeles, planting a massive corporate flag in one of the most expensive creative real estate markets in the United States. Google was actively recruiting top-tier talent from across the gaming industry, veteran engineers, lead writers, concept artists, and technical directors who had previously built iconic franchises for Sony, Microsoft, and EA. The industry narrative shifted immediately. Google was no longer just an infrastructure provider offering a neat technological trick. They were building an autonomous, in-house content engine. The sheer scale of the investment sent a clear, intimidating signal to both developers and the American market. Alphabet, one of the wealthiest corporate entities on Earth, was preparing to spend billions of dollars to brute force its way to the top of the gaming industry. SG&E began prototyping games that would supposedly leverage the unique, unbounded power of the data center. Titles where physics calculations were far too complex for a local machine, and where thousands of players could theoretically interact in a single, unbroken digital world. The scale of Google's ambition was no longer just a theoretical white paper. It was a physical reality playing out on screens across the country. In an American living room, the gap between a $70 Chromecast Ultra dongle and a $500 gaming console was suddenly erased, provided the broadband held up. For a family that previously could not justify spending half a paycheck on a dedicated gaming box, Stadia offered a profound democratization of technology. The ritual of gaming was fundamentally altered. A teenager could pause a YouTube video showing a game trailer, click a button, and immediately drop into a massive multiplayer universe on an aging family desktop computer. A business traveler could sit in a hotel room, pull out a standard Android smartphone, connect a controller via Wi-Fi, and stream a 4K video feed of a EUI title that would normally require a massive gaming tower to run. The heavy lifting was completely removed from the user's hands. The physical night blue controller, resting on a coffee table, became a symbol of a frictionless future. You picked it up, pressed the Stadia button, and the television woke up. Within seconds, you were standing in the virtual Wild West of Red Dead Redemption 2, a game that required over 100 gigabytes of local storage on competing systems. There were no loading bars for patches. There were no storage-full error messages. There was only the game. This was the pinnacle of the cloud gaming promise. The ecosystem felt incredibly robust. Major publishers like Ubisoft and Electronic Arts were bringing their massive franchises to the platform, treating Stadia as a legitimate fourth pillar alongside PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo. Google was actively rolling out highly ambitious platform features that local hardware simply could not replicate. They introduced crowdplay, a feature that allowed viewers watching a live stream on YouTube to click a button and jump directly into the game alongside the creator. They launched State Share, a tool that allowed players to send a simple web link to a friend, instantly dropping them into the exact same moment and game state they were just playing, with the exact same inventory and health pool. These were not just gimmicks, they were structural changes to how interactive media could be consumed and shared. The platform was no longer trying to merely emulate the console experience. It was attempting to completely surpass it. By integrating gaming directly into the world's largest video platform, YouTube, Google was building a distribution funnel that no traditional hardware manufacturer could match. Inside the corporate offices of competitors in Redmond and Tokyo, there was genuine concern. The American tech landscape had seen this exact pattern of disruption before. When a company with the sheer infrastructural weight, financial capital, and server density of Google sets its sights on a new market, it rarely loses. Google had already conquered the search engine, the digital map, the email inbox, and the mobile phone operating system. Video games seemed to be the logical next step in their conquest of American digital life. With SG&E aggressively hiring hundreds of industry veterans and the server infrastructure successfully handling the massive influx of pandemic-era gamers, the platform felt indestructible. The tech press published glowing editorials about the sheer technical wizardry of the stream. For a few months, it seemed that the age of the heavy, expensive plastic box sitting under the television was finally drawing to a close. Google had successfully solved the hardest engineering problem in the room. They had beaten input lag and delivered a high-fidelity video stream across thousands of miles of American fiber optics and cable lines. But an ecosystem is a fragile thing. It requires a delicate, sustained balance of user trust, developer commitment, and corporate patience. Google had built a flawless technological pipeline, but they had not solved the cultural and economic realities of the American tech market. The technology worked, but the business model was quietly suffocating the user base. The stream was fast, den Stanstig ist da ausstands, but the internet service providers controlling the pipes into American homes were preparing to enforce their own limits. For a brief moment in the winter of 2020, Google Stadia did not just feel like an alternative. It felt like the inevitable future of interactive entertainment. But an empire built on the cloud cannot stand if the foundation underneath is quietly pulled away. The first small crack in the Stadia empire did not happen inside a Google data center. It happened when American internet service providers began mailing overage bills to family homes. To stream a video game in 4K resolution at 60 frames per second requires a tremendous, unbroken pipeline of data. Unlike a movie streaming service, which can compress its video feed or buffer data during quiet moments, a video game is highly reactive and constantly changing. Stadia consumed up to 20 gigabytes of data per hour at its highest settings. The problem was that the American internet was not a limitless utility. Major telecom carriers and cable providers like Comcast and AT&T actively enforced data caps, strict limits on how much digital information a single household could download in a month, usually capped at 1 terabyte. Inside an American living room, a teenager playing Destiny 2 on Stadia for just 2 or 3 hours a night could completely exhaust a family's entire monthly internet allowance in less than 3 weeks. Once that cap was breached, the ISPs levied heavy financial penalties. The Stadia hardware was technically cheap, but the invisible toll booth of the American telecom industry made the daily habit economically dangerous. The platform had successfully bypassed the console, but it had run directly into the limits of American infrastructure. This friction compounded a much deeper flaw in Google's approach to the market. Their business model directly contradicted consumer psychology. American users had been trained by platforms like Netflix and Spotify that a monthly subscription, a recurring fee for continued access, unlocked an entire library of content. But Stadia did not operate like a true buffet. Users paid $9.99 a month for Stadia Pro to access the 4K streaming tier and a small, rotating selection of older games. If a user wanted to play a brand new AAA release, they still had to purchase it individually at the full $59.99 retail price. This created a massive wall of hesitation in the digital software aisle. When an American gamer bought a physical disc at Best Buy, they owned a tangible object. When they bought a digital download on an Xbox or PlayStation, the files lived safely on their local hard drive. But buying a full-priced game on Stadia meant paying $60 for a digital license that only existed on Google's servers. The user owned nothing. To make matters worse, Google was already haunted by its own corporate history. The American tech community was acutely aware of the Google graveyard, the company's notorious habit of launching ambitious software platforms, chat apps, and hardware devices, only to abruptly shut them down a few years later if they did not reach 1 billion users. Gamers looked at the $59.99 price tag and asked a highly rational question. What happens to this money if Google gets bored of video games? To overcome this lack of trust, a platform needs a massive, vibrant ecosystem of third-party developers. It needed so many games that the platform felt permanent. But here, Google faced the brutal reality of software economics. The Stadia servers were built on Linux, an open-source operating system rarely used for consumer PC gaming. For the last 20 years, the American gaming industry had built its software engines specifically for Microsoft Windows and traditional consoles. Porting a game, the highly complex process of translating underlying code to work on a completely different operating system, was not a matter of simply pressing a button. It required millions of dollars in engineering labor, rigorous testing, and months of dedicated work. Publishers were not willing to spend millions of dollars porting games to a platform with a small, unproven user base. To break this stalemate, Google had to write massive checks, reportedly paying tens of millions of dollars to publishers like Ubisoft and Take-Two Interactive just to get a handful of blockbuster titles onto the platform. It was an artificial ecosystem, kept alive entirely by Google's checkbook. To truly control their own destiny, Google needed exclusive first-party games. They needed the massive Los Angeles and Montreal studios of Stadia Games and Entertainment to produce titles that would force American gamers to log in. But on February 1st, 2021, just 14 months after the platform launched, the ecosystem suffered a catastrophic, self-inflicted fracture. Google published a sudden corporate blog post announcing the immediate closure of all SG&E development studios. Jade Raymond, the high-profile executive hired to lead the division, exited the company. Nearly 150 developers were laid off or reassigned. There was no warning. Developers who were actively working on prototypes in their home offices and new hires who were in the middle of relocating to California found out their jobs were gone. Google executives claimed this was merely a strategic pivot, a decision to stop making games internally and focus entirely on providing cloud technology to third-party partners. But in the American tech market, perception is reality. By killing its own studios, Google had signaled to the entire industry that the company's leadership was no longer willing to absorb the massive, long-term financial losses required to build a gaming empire. If one of the richest corporations on Earth did not believe in Stadia enough to build games for it, why would any independent developer risk their own money to do the same? The servers were still humming, the screens were still bright, but the culture that gave the platform life had just packed its bags. By the spring of 2021, the American tech market was witnessing a textbook example of ecosystem collapse, the rapid weakening of a product when users, developers, partners, and cultural attention leave at the same time. The closure of Google's internal studios sent a chilling message to independent software creators. If Google was no longer willing to underwrite the massive financial risk of building games for Stadia, third-party developers were certainly not going to pay for it themselves. The platform became a victim of reverse network effects. Network effects dictate that a product becomes more valuable as more people use it, drawing in more developers, which in turn draws in more users. But when the cycle reverses, it accelerates towards zero. Without a guarantee of new, exclusive titles, the American user base stopped growing. Without a growing user base, major publishers like Square Enix and Electronic Arts could no longer justify the exorbitant costs of porting their software to Stadia's custom Linux servers. The digital store shelves grew stagnant. Updates for existing games were quietly delayed. Multiplayer lobbies, the virtual rooms where players gather before a match, became ghost towns. An American gamer logging in to play a competitive shooter on Stadia often found themselves waiting in an empty digital room, staring at a matchmaking screen that never found another player. But the final fatal blow did not come from Google's internal mismanagement. It came from Redmond, Washington. While Google was trying to convince the American consumer to abandon their hardware entirely, Microsoft was taking a radically different approach. Microsoft owned the Xbox ecosystem, and they understood that cloud gaming was not a replacement for local hardware. It was a feature meant to complement it. They launched Xbox Game Pass Ultimate, a subscription service that actually delivered on the Netflix for Games promise. For a flat monthly fee, American gamers gained instant access to a massive library of hundreds of games that could be downloaded locally to an Xbox console or a Windows desktop computer. Crucially, Microsoft eventually bundled their own cloud streaming service directly into Game Pass Ultimate at no extra cost. This completely shattered Stadia's value proposition. An American gamer no longer had to choose between owning hardware or streaming from the cloud. They could have both. More importantly, when an Xbox user streamed a game to their smartphone while sitting in an airport terminal, they were tapping into the exact same profile, the exact same save data, and the exact same multiplayer servers as the millions of people playing on physical Xbox consoles at home. Stadia was an isolated island. Xbox Cloud Gaming was an extension of an empire that already existed. This was the crushing reality of convenience displacement, the market force where a new technology absorbs a product by simply making it a built-in feature somewhere else. Stadia demanded that the user abandon their existing digital library and buy into a completely unproven ecosystem. Microsoft simply added a Play from Cloud button to the games users already owned. Faced with this overwhelming competitive displacement, Google began a quiet, humiliating retreat. Throughout 2021 and early 2022, the company initiated a strategy of brand dilution, the weakening of a brand when its technology is stripped of its original promise and sold off as parts. Google started pitching the underlying streaming technology, now internally referred to as immersive stream for games, to other corporate entities. They partnered with the American telecom giant AT&T to let customers stream the game Batman, Arkham Knight directly through a web browser. They even licensed the technology to Peloton, the exercise bike company, to power simple workout games on small fitness screens. The revolutionary platform that was supposed to replace the traditional console had been reduced to a white label backend for a stationary bicycle. The user base knew the end was near. In the American tech press, the question was no longer if Stadia would shut down, but when. The answer arrived on September 29, 2022. Google published a brief clinical blog post announcing that the Stadia service would officially be terminated in January of the following year. In a desperate bid to preserve whatever consumer trust remained for their other enterprise cloud services, Google announced they would automatically refund every piece of Stadia hardware purchased through their official store, along with every single game and piece of digital add-on content. It was a staggering financial write-off. Hundreds of millions of dollars were simply returned to American bank accounts. But the refunds could not buy back the lost time. Independent developers who were weeks away from launching their games on Stadia suddenly found their contracts voided and their potential revenue erased. Gamers who had spent hundreds of hours building digital cities, leveling up characters, and exploring virtual worlds realized that because they never truly owned the local files, their save data was about to be permanently deleted. On the night of January 18, 2023, a few thousand die-hard users logged in for the final time. They gathered in the multiplayer lobbies of Red Dead Online and Destiny 2, recording the final moments on their screens. As the midnight deadline approached, the streams simply froze. The connection error messages appeared. The screens went black. The data caps held. The library stagnated. The users migrated. The developers retreated. The parent company lost interest. The servers went dark. The refunds were issued. The software vanished entirely. The ecosystem was dead, but across America, hundreds of thousands of pieces of plastic hardware were suddenly left behind, waiting for a final, unexpected act of preservation. When the Stadia servers officially shut down in early 2023, the brand did not experience a triumphant resurrection. It suffered a quiet, systemic corporate erasure. Google took the underlying engineering, the custom Linux infrastructure, and the low-latency streaming pipeline, and attempted to pivot it into a white-label enterprise product called Google Cloud Immersive Stream. But without a dedicated consumer ecosystem or a cultural anchor, even that enterprise initiative quickly faded. The Stadia name was completely scrubbed from the American digital storefront, joining a long, crowded list of discontinued Google projects. The ecosystem was thoroughly dead. But a platform is not just made of code. it leaves behind a physical footprint. In the weeks leading up to the final server shutdown, a pressing environmental and cultural question emerged across the American tech landscape. What was going to happen to the hundreds of thousands of Stadia controllers sitting in living rooms, dormitories, and desk drawers? Because of Google's unique engineering solution to input lag, the Stadia controller was designed to connect via Wi-Fi directly to a remote data center. It lacked standard Bluetooth functionality out of the box, meaning it could not easily connect locally to a standard desktop PC, tablet, or smartphone. When the servers died, the controller was effectively bricked, a beautifully designed ergonomic piece of electronic waste that could no longer speak to the network it was built for. Then, in a rare, surprising footnote to a massive corporate cancellation, Google's engineering team offered a parting gift to the American preservation community. Just days before the final shutdown, Google released a specialized web-based firmware update tool. By plugging the controller into a computer via a USB cable and navigating to a specific Chrome browser page, American users could flash the internal memory of the controller. This one-way update permanently deactivated the Wi-Fi chip and fully unlocked the dormant Bluetooth radio inside the hardware. It was an unprecedented move in an industry that usually locks down dead hardware with rigid digital rights management. Overnight, a vibrant enthusiast community mobilized across Reddit, Discord, and vintage tech forums. Users shared guides on how to properly execute the firmware flash before Google eventually took the tool offline. Tinkerers and independent developers wrote open-source drivers to map the Stadia controller to Windows PCs, Steam Decks, and Mac setups. The controller, originally built to bypass local hardware entirely, was suddenly reborn as a highly capable, localized PC peripheral. Today, if you walk into an American thrift store or browse the listings on eBay or Craigslist, you will frequently find these sleek, night blue, wasabi, or clearly white controllers. They are no longer portals to a multi-million-dollar data center. They are simply excellent, standard gamepads. The preservation of the Stadia controller is not an act of nostalgia. No one is deeply nostalgic for a corporate storefront that asked them to pay $60 for a digital license they could never download. The preservation of this hardware is a physical testament to a pivotal moment in American technology history. The exact moment the tech industry realized that cloud gaming could not survive as an isolated island. Stadia matters because it was the ultimate billion-dollar beta test for the entire gaming industry. Google proved beyond any technical doubt that the engineering of cloud gaming was actually possible. They proved that an American gamer could play a graphically demanding 4K title over a standard internet connection with almost zero input lag. They solved the hardest physics problem in the room. But in doing so, they also proved that the American consumer will not abandon their local hardware for a platform that lacks a permanent library, a trusted brand identity, and a deeply rooted developer ecosystem. The legacy of Stadia is visible every time an American teenager opens Xbox Game Pass on their phone, or every time a PC gamer uses NVIDIA GeForce Now to stream a game they already own on their Steam account. Those competing platforms succeeded specifically because they learned from Google's fatal error. They realized that the cloud cannot replace the console. The cloud can only be a feature that extends the ecosystem the user has already built. Stadia tried to be the entire destination, and it suffocated under its own ambition. America did not stop wanting the future of frictionless, instant entertainment. It simply refused to buy that future from a company that treated video games like an expendable web service. The streaming technology worked flawlessly, but the creators of the platform forgot that a video game is not just a stream of visual data. It is an investment of time, money, culture, and trust. And trust cannot be rendered in a remote data center. Somewhere in an American desk drawer, a Stadia controller still sits with a clean white shell, and a fully unlocked Bluetooth chip. It's amber status light forever dark, waiting for a connection to a server room that no longer exists. See you in the next one.